Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of person who blended into the background. At just 26 years old, she had already carved out a name for herself in New Hampshire, a place known for its tight-knit communities and no-nonsense attitude. She grew up in a small town where life was simple but tough. Her parents worked hard to make ends meet, teaching her early on that nothing good comes easy. They always told her, "Stand firm in what you believe, even if it feels like the whole world is against you." Those words stuck with her, shaping the way she approached everything in life. From a young age, Karoline showed signs of being different, not in a flashy or attention-seeking way, but in how deeply she cared about fairness and honesty. When something didn't sit right with her, she couldn't stay quiet. Whether it was calling out a bully at school or questioning a teacher's decision that seemed unfair, she had this fire inside her that wouldn't let her back down. People either admired her boldness or found it intimidating. But one thing was certain: when Karoline spoke, people listened. As she got older, her passion for speaking truth to power only grew stronger. After college, instead of chasing a corporate job or settling into a comfortable routine, she decided to dive headfirst into politics. It wasn't because she wanted fame or money. It was because she believed there were too many voices going unheard. She saw families struggling to pay their bills, kids missing out on opportunities because schools were underfunded, and businesses closing down because of heavy regulations. These weren't just abstract problems to her. They were real issues, affecting real people, people she knew personally. When Karoline first stepped into the political arena, not many took her seriously. Some dismissed her as too young, too inexperienced, or too idealistic, but she didn't waste time trying to prove them wrong. Instead, she focused on showing up, listening to people, and fighting for the causes she cared about. Slowly, but surely, people started paying attention. They realized that behind her youthful energy was someone who genuinely cared about making things better. Then came the moment that would change everything. Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, announced he'd be visiting New Hampshire. He was coming to rally support for his party's candidates ahead of an upcoming election. The news spread quickly, and excitement rippled through the state. Supporters began lining up hours before his arrival, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who once led the country. For many, it was a chance to relive the hope and optimism of his presidency, but not everyone shared the same enthusiasm. Karoline watched from the sidelines, observing the buzz around Obama's visit. To her, he wasn't just a celebrity politician. He represented policies and decisions that she felt had left ordinary Americans behind. From healthcare laws that burdened small businesses to foreign policy moves that raised more questions than answers, she believed his legacy was far from perfect. And when he gave a speech criticizing conservatives for being divisive and unwilling to compromise, something inside her snapped. She thought, "This isn't leadership. This is talking down to people without understanding their struggles." That's when she made up her mind. She wasn't going to sit back and let those comments slide. This was her chance to step up, to remind everyone that standing up for your beliefs doesn't mean shutting others out. It means engaging with them, even when it's uncomfortable. Little did she know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would put her directly in the national spotlight. For Karoline, this wasn't about picking a fight or scoring political points. It was about giving a voice to those who felt silenced. It was about reminding everyone that democracy works best when we challenge each other to do better. And so, with determination burning in her chest, she began preparing for what would become one of the most defining moments of her career, a face-off with none other than Barack Obama himself. The day Barack Obama arrived in New Hampshire, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. People came from all over the state, some traveling hours just to hear him speak. The line stretched for blocks outside the venue, filled with supporters clutching signs and wearing T-shirts emblazoned with his name. To them, he wasn't just a former president, he was a symbol of hope, progress, and change. For many, seeing him in person felt like reliving the excitement of his historic presidency. Karoline Leavitt stood on the fringes of the crowd, watching silently as people cheered and chanted. She didn't share their enthusiasm. Instead, she felt a mix of frustration and determination bubbling inside her. While everyone else seemed swept up in the moment, she couldn't ignore what she saw as glaring contradictions in Obama's message. His speeches often painted conservatives as obstacles to progress, people who refuse to work together or care about the greater good. But Karoline knew that wasn't true. She'd spent years working alongside folks who wanted nothing more than to improve their communities, even if they didn't always agree with the methods being pushed by those in power. As Obama took the stage, the room erupted into applause. He began speaking, his voice smooth and confident, weaving stories of unity and collaboration. He talked about the importance of coming together across party lines, yet moments later, he criticized Republicans for creating division. Karoline listened intently, jotting down notes on a small notepad she kept tucked in her pocket. Every time he mentioned conservatives or opposition, she felt her resolve harden. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. There was an undercurrent of condescension, as if he believed anyone who disagreed with him simply didn't understand the issues at hand. When Obama made a comment dismissing conservative policies as outdated and harmful, something inside Karoline clicked. She thought, "This isn't fair. This isn't honest." She remembered the countless conversations she'd had with voters, young parents worried about rising taxes, seniors struggling to afford health care, business owners trying to keep their doors open despite mounting regulations. These weren't faceless statistics. They were real people with real problems. And here was someone painting their concerns as irrelevant or selfish without truly understanding where they were coming from. By the time Obama wrapped up his speech, the crowd was on its feet, cheering wildly. But Karoline remained seated, her mind racing. She replayed his words over and over in her head, dissecting every phrase and implication. It wasn't just about disagreeing with his politics, it was about the way he framed the conversation. He spoke as though there was only one right way to think, one correct path forward, and anyone who dared to question that path, they were labeled as part of the problem. That night, Karoline sat alone in her apartment, staring at the notes she'd scribbled earlier. Her heart pounded as she realized this was bigger than just a disagreement. It was a chance to stand up for something. She thought about all the times she'd been told she was too young, too inexperienced, or too idealistic to make a difference. Now, here she was, staring down the opportunity to challenge one of the most influential figures in modern politics. It scared her, sure, but it also excited her. If she could articulate her thoughts clearly, if she could present her case with facts and passion, maybe, just maybe, she could shift the narrative. Over the next few days, Karoline poured herself into research. She rewatched Obama's speech multiple times, pausing after each sentence to analyze its meaning. She dug through articles, reports, and data to back up her arguments. She wanted to be prepared, not just to criticize, but to offer solutions. This wasn't about tearing someone down. It was about building something better. She knew that if she went into this half-hearted or unprepared, she'd lose credibility. So she worked tirelessly, staying up late into the night, fueled by coffee and sheer determination. Her team noticed the intensity in her eyes and tried to caution her. "You're taking on a giant," one of them said during a strategy meeting. "Are you ready for the backlash?" Karoline nodded, her expression unwavering. "I'm not doing this for me," she replied. "I'm doing it for everyone who feels like their voice doesn't matter. If we can't hold our leaders accountable, then what's the point?" As the days passed, Karoline began drafting her response. She started with a simple acknowledgement of Obama's accomplishments, recognizing the positive impact he'd had on millions of lives. But then, she shifted gears, addressing the inconsistencies in his recent comments. She highlighted examples of bipartisan efforts that proved conservatives weren't the divisive force he claimed they were. She pointed out flaws in policies he championed, using real-life stories from constituents to drive her points home. Each word was chosen carefully, balancing firmness with respect. By the time she finished writing, Karoline felt a strange sense of calm. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be critics, skeptics, and opponents eager to tear her apart. But she also knew this: standing up for what you believe in, even when it's scary, is what makes democracy work. and as she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, she whispered to herself, "Let's do this." What happened next would test her courage, her convictions, and her ability to inspire others. But one thing was certain. Karoline Leavitt was ready to take gloves off and step into the arena, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Karoline Leavitt didn't walk into this fight blind. She knew exactly what she was up against, a former president of the United States, a man whose name alone could fill rooms and inspire millions. But Karoline wasn't intimidated. If anything, the challenge only fueled her determination. For weeks, she immersed herself in preparation, treating it like the most important exam of her life. This wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about proving that ideas mattered more than titles, that truth could hold its own against charisma. Her days became a whirlwind of research, phone calls, and late-night brainstorming sessions. She pored over transcripts of Obama's speeches, analyzing every word he'd ever said about conservatives. She highlighted contradictions, noted oversights, and flagged moments where his tone felt dismissive or patronizing. It wasn't enough to simply disagree with him. She needed to understand his perspective inside and out. Only then could she craft a response that was both sharp and respectful. But facts alone weren't going to cut it. Karoline knew that people connect with stories, not statistics. So she reached out to the very people she aimed to represent: the farmers, teachers, veterans, and small business owners who made up the backbone of her community. She asked them to share their experiences, to tell her how policies championed by leaders like Obama had impacted their lives. Some talked about struggling to afford health care despite promises of affordability. Others spoke of businesses forced to close because of regulations they couldn't keep up with. These weren't abstract complaints. They were raw, personal accounts of hardship and resilience. Karoline wrote each story down, weaving them into her rebuttal like threads in a tapestry. As the pieces came together, Karoline began rehearsing her speech. Standing in front of a mirror in her modest apartment, she practiced delivering her words with clarity and conviction. She timed herself, adjusted her tone, and worked on making eye contact, even if the audience was just her reflection, staring back at her. Her team watched her progress, offering feedback and encouragement. They reminded her to breathe, to pause for effect, and to let her passion shine through without letting it overwhelm her message. Still, doubts lingered. Late one night, after hours of preparation, Karoline sat at her kitchen table, staring at the draft of her speech. The weight of what she was about to do hit her all at once. What if she stumbled? What if no one listened? What if critics tore her apart online? These questions swirled in her mind, threatening to shake her confidence. But then she remembered why she started this journey in the first place. Not for applause or recognition, but to give a voice to those who felt silenced. Taking a deep breath, she whispered to herself, "You've got this." The next morning, she gathered her team for a final strategy session. Together, they went over every detail, from the timing of her delivery to the way she'd handle potential pushback. One advisor suggested softening some of her language, fearing it might come across as too confrontational. But Karoline shook her head firmly. "If we sugarcoat the truth," she said, "we're doing a disservice to the people I'm fighting for. Respectful doesn't mean weak." Her team nodded, respecting her decision even as they braced themselves for the storm ahead. By the time she stepped onto the stage at a local community center, Karoline was ready, but not in the way most people think of readiness. She wasn't invincible or fearless. Instead, she carried a quiet certainty, a belief that she was doing the right thing no matter the cost. As she looked out at the crowd, she saw faces filled with curiosity, skepticism, and even hostility. Some had come to support her, others had come to see her fail, but none of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was the message she was about to deliver. When she finally began speaking, her voice was steady, almost calm. She opened with a nod to Obama's achievements, acknowledging the positive changes he'd brought to countless lives. It was a small gesture, but an important one. It showed she wasn't there to attack him personally. Then she transitioned into the heart of her argument, laying out point after point with precision and care. She cited specific examples of policies that had fallen short, backed by the real-life stories she'd collected. She pointed out inconsistencies in his rhetoric, using his own words to highlight the gaps between promise and reality. The room grew quieter as she spoke, the initial murmurs fading into silence. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't help but listen. There was something compelling about the way she presented her case, not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet strength that demanded attention. By the time she finished, the audience erupted into applause, though not everyone agreed with her. Some clapped out of admiration for her courage. Others did so reluctantly, acknowledging the power of her argument. Either way, Karoline had done what she set out to do. She'd sparked a conversation. Walking off the stage, Karoline felt a mix of relief and exhilaration. She hadn't delivered a perfect performance, no one does, but she'd stayed true to herself and her beliefs. And while she knew the hardest part was yet to come, the media scrutiny, the backlash, the endless debates, she also knew she'd taken a stand when it mattered most. That alone was worth everything. For Karoline, this moment wasn't just about confronting Barack Obama. It was about proving to herself and to others that leadership isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about facing it head-on, with honesty and integrity. Whether people agreed with her or not, one thing was undeniable. Karoline Leavitt had thrown her gloves off, and she wasn't backing down anytime soon. The day of the showdown arrived, and the room buzzed with anticipation. People packed into the community center, filling every seat and spilling into the aisles. Some had come to support Karoline, eager to see how she'd take on such a towering figure as Barack Obama. Others were skeptics, curious to witness what they assumed would be an uneven battle between a young politician and a former president. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and social media feeds lit up with speculation about what was about to unfold. When Karoline stepped onto the stage, there was a brief hush. She looked calm, almost serene, but her eyes betrayed the intensity burning inside her. For weeks, she'd been preparing for this moment, poring over data, rehearsing her words, and reminding herself why she was doing this. Now, standing in front of a crowd that included both allies and adversaries, she felt the weight of the occasion settle over her. This wasn't just another speech. It was her chance to speak truth to power. She began softly, acknowledging Obama's legacy and the impact he'd had on millions of lives. President Obama inspired hope in so many people, she said, her voice steady. His vision for change resonated across the country, and no one can deny the positive strides made during his time in office. The audience nodded along, some clapping politely. It was a smart move. Starting with respect softened the blow of what was coming next. But anyone paying close attention could sense the shift in tone as she continued. But, she said, pausing for emphasis, leadership isn't just about inspiring hope. It's about delivering results. And when we look at some of the policies implemented under his administration, we have to ask, did they truly serve all Americans? The room went still. You could hear a pin drop. Karoline leaned slightly forward, gripping the podium with both hands. Her delivery was measured, but there was fire behind her words. She launched into specific examples, laying out her case point by point. First, she tackled healthcare, a topic that always sparked heated debate. The Affordable Care Act promised affordable coverage for everyone, she said. But for many families I've spoken to, premiums skyrocketed and choices dwindled. A single mom working 2 jobs told me she couldn't afford the plan she was offered. Is that really progress? The audience murmured in agreement, especially those who had struggled with similar issues. Next, she turned to foreign policy, an area where Obama often received praise. Yes, ending wars is important, she admitted. But what about the consequences? When we pulled troops out of certain regions too quickly, it created vacuums that extremist groups filled. That left our allies vulnerable and put American security at risk. Again, she backed her claims with facts, citing reports and expert opinions. Even those who disagreed with her found it hard to dismiss her arguments outright. They were grounded in evidence, not emotion. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for, addressing Obama's recent comments about conservatives. Karoline didn't mince words here. President Obama has accused conservatives of being divisive, of refusing to work together. But let's talk about reality for a moment. Conservatives aren't against compromise, we're against bad compromises. We're against policies that hurt the very people they claim to help. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. I've met farmers who've lost their livelihoods because of trade wars. I've talked to veterans who feel abandoned by a system that should be supporting them. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of policies that sound good on paper but fail in practice. And yet, when we raise these concerns, we're labeled as obstructionists. That's not fair, and it's not accurate. By now, the room was electric. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on her every word. Even critics who walked in expecting a rant found themselves nodding along. Karoline wasn't just criticizing Obama, she was offering solutions. She proposed alternative approaches to healthcare, tax reform, and education, framing them as ways to unite rather than divide. Her message was clear. Disagreement doesn't mean disdain. It means wanting something better. As she wrapped up her speech, Karoline took a deep breath and looked directly at the audience. This isn't about me versus him, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the larger-than-life shadow of Obama's influence. It's about us versus the problems we face as a nation. If we want real change, we need to stop vilifying each other and start listening. Because at the end of the day, we're all on the same team. The room erupted into applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from genuine appreciation. People stood, cheering loudly, while others remained seated, processing what they'd just heard. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions, and within minutes, clips of Karoline's speech were circulating online. Social media exploded with commentary, ranging from admiration to outrage. Critics accused her of being disrespectful, while supporters hailed her as a hero for standing up to a political giant. Backstage, Karoline exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. She hadn't expected universal approval, but the sheer magnitude of the response surprised her. As she shook hands with well-wishers and answered quick questions from reporters, she reminded herself of one thing. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about sparking a conversation about accountability, honesty, and the future of the country. That night, as she lay in bed replaying the events of the day, Karoline allowed herself a small smile. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be backlash, criticism, and moments of doubt. But she also knew she'd done something remarkable. In taking gloves off and confronting a former president, she hadn't just proven her own strength. She'd given countless others permission to do the same. And that, more than anything, made it all worth it. The fallout from Karoline's speech was immediate and intense. Within hours, her rebuttal to Barack Obama had gone viral, spreading far beyond the confines of the community center where she delivered it. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions, some praising her boldness, others criticizing her audacity. News outlets picked up the story, turning what had started as a local event into a national conversation. For better or worse, Karoline Leavitt was now in the spotlight. Supporters hailed her as a modern-day David taking on Goliath. They saw her as someone who refused to back down, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Finally, someone is calling out the hypocrisy, one commenter wrote on Twitter. She spoke for all of us who feel ignored. Others shared personal stories of how policies from Obama's era had impacted their lives, echoing the very examples Karoline had cited in her speech. Her office was inundated with messages of gratitude, many from people who said they finally felt heard, but not everyone was pleased. Critics wasted no time tearing into her, accusing her of grandstanding and disrespecting a former president. Some called her unqualified, pointing to her age and relative inexperience as reasons why she shouldn't have challenged someone of Obama's stature. "Who does she think she is?" one op-ed read. "This kind of arrogance is exactly why politics has become so toxic." Others dismissed her arguments outright, claiming she was cherry-picking data to fit her narrative. The backlash was fierce, and at times, deeply personal. Karoline braced herself for the storm. She knew going in that challenging a figure like Obama wouldn't come without consequences. Still, reading some of the harsh comments stung more than she expected. Late one night, after scrolling through endless tweets and articles, she closed her laptop and sighed. Her assistant, sensing her frustration, handed her a cup of tea. "You knew this would happen," he reminded her gently. "It's part of the deal," she nodded, sipping the warm drink. "I did know," she admitted. But knowing something and feeling it are two different things. Despite the criticism, she refused to let it shake her resolve. Instead, she leaned into the controversy, using it as an opportunity to further amplify her message. In interviews, she reiterated her belief that healthy debate was essential for democracy. "If we can't question our leaders, even the ones we admire, then we're not truly free," she told one reporter. "Disagreement isn't disloyalty. It's accountability." Her team worked tirelessly to manage the chaos, issuing statements, booking appearances, and monitoring the online discourse. Donations poured in for her campaign, fueled by supporters eager to back her cause. Invitations to speak at high-profile events flooded her inbox, each one offering a new platform to share her views. What had started as a single act of defiance had transformed into a movement, a rallying cry for those who believed in standing up, even when it seemed impossible. Obama's camp eventually responded, though their statement was brief and somewhat dismissive. They accused Karoline of playing politics, suggesting her critique was less about policy and more about gaining attention. But their lukewarm reply only added fuel to her fire. Supporters pointed out that if her arguments were so baseless, surely Obama's team could have offered a stronger defense. Instead, their weak response seemed to validate her points, further solidifying her credibility. Through it all, Karoline remained grounded. She made a conscious effort to avoid getting caught up in the noise, focusing instead on the bigger picture. This wasn't about her ego or scoring political points. It was about creating meaningful change. Every interview she gave, every article she wrote, and every speech she delivered was aimed at keeping the conversation alive. She wanted people to think critically about leadership, policy, and the direction of the country. One of the most surprising outcomes of the fallout was the unexpected support she received from unlikely corners. Moderates and even some liberals reached out to commend her for having the courage to challenge orthodoxy. "I don't agree with everything you said," one person wrote in an email, "but I respect your willingness to engage. Too many politicians just stick to talking points without addressing real issues." These moments reminded Karoline that while opinions might differ, there was common ground to be found, if only people were willing to listen. As the weeks went by, the initial frenzy began to die down, but the impact lingered. Karoline's name became synonymous with fearless advocacy, earning her both admirers and detractors. Polls showed her approval ratings climbing among conservatives, while remaining polarizing across party lines. Yet she didn't measure success by popularity. To her, the true victory lay in sparking dialogue, getting people to question assumptions, examine evidence, and consider perspectives other than their own. Reflecting on the whirlwind, Karoline realized something important. Standing up to power wasn't just about winning arguments. It was about inspiring others to do the same. Young women in particular reached out to thank her for showing them that it was possible to challenge authority without losing integrity. "Seeing you take on someone like Obama gives me hope," one young woman wrote. "It makes me believe I can make a difference too." Messages like these reinforced why Karoline had entered politics in the first place, to give a voice to those who felt powerless. By the time the dust settled, Karoline had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The experience taught her valuable lessons, not just about navigating public scrutiny, but also about staying true to herself. She understood that not everyone would agree with her views, and that was okay. Democracy thrived on diverse perspectives, and disagreement was part of the process. What mattered most was approaching debates with honesty, humility, and a genuine desire to improve lives. Looking ahead, Karoline knew the road wouldn't get easier. Challenges awaited at every turn, and the stakes would only grow higher. But she faced them with the same determination that had brought her this far. Taking gloves off to confront Barack Obama had been a defining moment in her career, but it was just the beginning. The real work, the work of shaping a brighter future, for all, was still ahead, and Karoline Leavitt was ready to roll up her sleeves and get to it. In the weeks that followed her confrontation with Barack Obama, Karoline Leavitt found herself reflecting deeply on what she had accomplished and what it truly meant. The whirlwind of media attention, public reactions, and political debates had left her both exhilarated and exhausted. She'd stepped into a national spotlight few could have predicted, but now as things began to quiet down, she realized this was the perfect time to take stock of everything. One of the most striking lessons she learned was the importance of courage. Not just in standing up for your beliefs, but in doing so when it feels like the entire world is watching. At first, she thought her biggest challenge would be articulating her arguments clearly, or countering Obama's charisma with logic and evidence. But she quickly realized that the hardest part wasn't speaking. It was staying grounded while everyone else weighed in. There were moments when the criticism felt overwhelming, when trolls online tried to tear her apart, or opponents painted her as reckless and divisive. Yet, through it all, she reminded herself why she started. To give a voice to those who felt unheard. She also discovered something unexpected: humility. Before this experience, Karoline had always prided herself on knowing exactly what she stood for. But engaging with such a wide range of opinions forced her to confront areas where her own understanding might be incomplete. During interviews and town hall meetings, people challenged her views, sometimes respectfully, other times not. At first, she bristled at some of the pushback, especially when it came from critics who seemed more interested in attacking her personally than debating ideas. But over time, she began to see these exchanges as opportunities to grow. You can't claim to care about listening if you're only willing to hear people who agree with you, she told herself one evening after a particularly tough Q&A session. What struck her most, though, was the outpouring of support from ordinary people. Messages poured in from across the country, emails, letters, social media comments, all expressing gratitude for her willingness to stand firm. Many shared their own struggles, opening up about how policies shaped by leaders like Obama had impacted their lives. A single father wrote to thank her for highlighting the rising costs of health care, explaining how he'd been forced to choose between paying his bills and buying medication for his daughter. A retired teacher described feeling abandoned by pension cuts that left her struggling to make ends meet. These stories reinforced why Karoline had entered politics in the first place, not for fame or power, but to advocate for real people facing real challenges. But perhaps the most humbling aspect of the entire ordeal was realizing how much work still lay ahead. Taking gloves off to challenge a former president had been a bold move, but it wasn't enough. Policies don't change overnight, and neither do mindsets. If anything, the backlash she faced underscored just how polarized the nation had become. People weren't just divided over issues, they were divided over how to talk about them. And that, Karoline realized, was the root of the problem. Determined to bridge that gap, she made a conscious effort to shift her approach. Instead of focusing solely on criticizing those in power, she began emphasizing collaboration. In speeches and interviews, she stressed the importance of finding common ground, even with those who disagreed with her. "We don't have to see eye to eye on everything to get things done," she said during a community forum. "But we do need to start seeing each other as human beings, not enemies." It was a message that resonated with many, including some of her harshest critics. Her team noticed the change too. Gone was the fiery defiance that had defined her initial rebuttal to Obama. In its place was a calmer, more measured tone, one rooted in empathy and a genuine desire to understand different perspectives. Her advisors encouraged her to lean into this new direction, believing it could broaden her appeal beyond conservative circles. "People respect strength," one of them said during a strategy meeting, "but they connect with vulnerability." As she traveled around New Hampshire, Meeting voters and attending local events, Karoline saw firsthand the impact of her evolving approach. Conversations that might once have turned heated instead became productive discussions. Even long-time skeptics admitted they appreciated her willingness to listen. One woman approached her after a town hall meeting and said, "I don't agree with half of what you say, but I respect that you're trying to bring people together. We need more of that." Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, lying awake in hotel rooms or staring out the window of her car, Karoline wondered if she was making a difference. Was she reaching enough people? Were her words translating into action? Sometimes the scale of the challenges before her felt insurmountable. Healthcare costs continued to rise. Small businesses struggled under the weight of regulations. Families worried about their children's futures. Progress seemed agonizingly slow. Yet every time she felt discouraged, she remembered the faces of the people she'd met along the way. The farmer fighting to keep his land, the veteran seeking better mental health services, the young mother juggling 2 jobs to provide for her kids. They reminded her that change doesn't happen all at once. It starts small, with conversations and connections, and builds momentum over time. And if she could inspire even one person to believe in the possibility of a better future, then her efforts weren't in vain. By the time autumn rolled around, Karoline had settled into a rhythm. She balanced fiery advocacy with thoughtful reflection, blending passion with pragmatism. Her showdown with Obama remained a defining moment in her career, but it no longer defined her entirely. She was more than the politician who took gloves off. It was clear she was someone committed to creating lasting change, however long it took. And so, as leaves turned golden and crisp air signaled the arrival of a new season, Karoline looked ahead with renewed purpose. The road was long and obstacles loomed large, but she carried with her the lessons she'd learned, the stories she'd heard, and the unwavering belief that standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard, is what makes democracy worth fighting for. Months had passed since Karoline Leavitt's bold confrontation with Barack Obama, and life had settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and new. The spotlight that had once shone so brightly on her began to dim, but its effects lingered in ways she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just the young politician who dared to challenge a former president anymore. She was a symbol of resilience, determination, and the power of speaking truth to authority. And while the whirlwind of media attention and public debates had slowed, the impact of her actions continued to ripple through her career, her community, and even her own sense of self. Karoline found herself busier than ever, traveling across New Hampshire and beyond to meet voters, attend events, and advocate for the causes she cared about. Her calendar was packed with town hall meetings, school visits, and small business tours. Each stop gave her a chance to reconnect with the people who mattered most, the everyday Americans whose lives were shaped by the policies she fought for. Whether it was sitting at a kitchen table with a family struggling to afford childcare, or touring a factory, where workers worried about automation taking their jobs, Karoline made sure her focus remained firmly on the human side of politics. One crisp morning, as she drove through winding country roads to visit a local farmer's market, Karoline reflected on how much she'd grown over the past year. She remembered the nervous energy she'd felt before stepping onto that stage to rebut Obama, the weight of knowing she was taking on someone far more powerful than herself. Back then, she wondered if she was ready for the responsibility. Now looking back, she realized that readiness wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created through action. Every speech, every debate, every tough conversation had taught her something valuable. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to listen deeply, and to stay true to her values no matter the pressure. The conversations she had now were different from those early days after her clash with Obama. People didn't come to her just to praise her bravery or criticize her stance. They came because they saw her as someone willing to roll up her sleeves and tackle real problems. At the farmer's market, an elderly man selling homemade jams pulled her aside to thank her for advocating for rural broadband access. "Without it," he said, "folks like me would be left behind." A young woman running a booth selling handmade crafts shared her struggles with student loan debt, sparking a discussion about education reform. These interactions reminded Karoline why she loved this work, not for the titles or accolades, but for the chance to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Her growing reputation brought new opportunities too. National organizations invited her to speak at conferences, and high-profile news outlets sought her insights on policy issues. Some urged her to run for higher office, saying she had the potential to become a national leader. But Karoline approached these suggestions cautiously. She knew ambition could be a double-edged sword. If she let it distract her from the needs of her constituents, she risked losing sight of what truly mattered. So she stayed grounded, focusing on the communities she represented and letting the future unfold naturally. Still, there were moments when she allowed herself to dream. What if she could take the lessons she'd learned in New Hampshire and apply them on a larger scale? What if she could inspire others to embrace honest dialogue and collaborative problem-solving? These thoughts excited her, not because they promised personal glory, but because they hinted at the possibility of broader change. If one person standing up could spark a movement, imagine what thousands working together could achieve. As winter approached and campaign season wound down, Karoline took time to pause and reflect. She spent quiet evenings at home sipping tea and jotting down notes about her journey. Writing helped her process everything she'd experienced, the highs, the lows, the victories, and the setbacks. It also reminded her of the importance of gratitude. She thought about her parents, whose lessons of hard work and integrity had guided her every step of the way. She thought about her team, who stood by her even when the odds felt impossible. And she thought about the countless strangers turned friends who had shared their stories, fueling her resolve to keep pushing forward. In December, during a holiday gathering at a local community center, Karoline stood before a crowd of supporters and volunteers. The room buzzed with laughter and warmth as families enjoyed hot cocoa and cookies. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone, smiling warmly at the faces around her. "This year has been a wild ride," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I've faced challenges I never imagined, met people I'll never forget, and learned lessons I'll carry with me forever." She paused, scanning the room. "But here's the thing. None of it was about me. It was always about you, all of you. Your voices, your struggles, your hopes, they're what drive me to keep going. And as we look ahead to the next chapter, I want you to remember something important. Change doesn't start with politicians or presidents. It starts with us, with ordinary people coming together to demand better." The room erupted into applause, and Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. She wasn't just speaking to the crowd. She was reminding herself of the same truth. Politics wasn't about grand gestures or flashy headlines. It was about showing up day after day, listening to people, and working tirelessly to improve their lives. That was the legacy she wanted to leave behind. As the evening drew to a close, Karoline lingered by the door, shaking hands and exchanging hugs with attendees. One woman, holding a toddler in her arms, stopped to thank her. "You give me hope," she said simply. Those 3 words stayed with Karoline long after the event ended. They summed up everything she hoped to achieve, not fame or power, but the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. Driving home under a starry sky, Karoline felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be obstacles, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But she was okay with that. Life wasn't about avoiding challenges. It was about facing them head-on, with courage and compassion. Taking gloves off to confront Barack Obama had been a defining moment, but it was only the beginning. The real work, the work of building bridges, solving problems, and shaping a brighter future, was just getting started. And as she turned off the highway toward her small town, lights twinkling in the distance, Karoline smiled. No matter what lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: she was exactly where she was meant to be.